International relations. Can anybody tell me what they think that means? Sandy.
Relationships with other countries?
Sure, relations. Wallace?
Basically, the way we interact and perceive other countries.
Right, interactions among various actors in the international sphere. IR is the study of conflict and cooperation by international actors. What are some types of actors that we have in international politics? Sure. What do those belong to? Who has diplomats?
Governments. 4 states.
States?
Any nation state?
Sure. Is that all we have in international politics? Governments? Jack?
Large corporations.
Corporations?
Non-state actors like militia and terrorists.
Right. There are 2 types of classifications of actors in international politics. State, non-state actors, right? Those are MNCs, multinational corporations, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, IGOs, international governmental organizations. The state. The state is the central actor in international politics today. International trade, conflict, cooperation, any interaction going to involve states. Those non-state actors, how do they most likely influence things? Engaging states. Can anyone think of what the definition of a state is? Yeah.
A body of people or a landmass under one government.
Okay. Anyone else? Jack.
In any self-governing body, self-governing nation. No. Took Mark's definition.
No, that's fine. Obviously, there's got to be some form of regime or government, right?
Mm-hmm.
That under an interpretation of sovereignty doesn't respond to any higher power, self-governing. Right. And Monica's also true, right? There's got to be some territorial boundary that separates a state from another state, something else. So this will be a human community that claims successfully, obviously, the monopoly of legitimate use of force within a given territory. What are some examples of this? No one can name a state.
United States.
Right.
Canada.
Yeah.
Cuba.
Yeah. Lots of them. I think there are, let's say, 191 according to the UN. And that's how states are recognized, right?
By the states.
By the UN. States only mean something or are given this sort of authority by mutual recognition in international politics. What's the purpose of a state? What does it do?
governs the people.
Sure. But why? What do we need one of those for?
So that there's no complete losses and chaos.
Jack?
To ensure order.
Okay. Any other function that a state has? Well,
Provide for the people, food, healthcare, protection.
right. Provides. Public goods. Goods that benefit everyone, irregardless of whether they contribute. Secondly, it creates incentives to free ride. There's some sort of reliance that the people have on this government, right? There's a reason we need governments, that we ask for governments, that human nature says we form states or groups. And to do these sort of things, what does the state often require to be able to effectively provide public goods and allow for reliance? What does the state need to do?
Tax.
Right. The state often needs to collect taxes, right? A prominent form of government revenue. Another thing that states are there for is to enforce contracts. What are some other qualities we think a state needs to have for recognition in international politics? I'm looking for a word.
Military power.
Sure, that's something. Starts with an L. To be recognized as an effective government that is able to provide a contribution in international politics.
It's laws.
Laws, sure. What I'm looking for is legitimacy. What do I mean by that when I say a state needs legitimacy for mutual recognition? Anyone? Chris, what do you think I mean when I say a state needs to be perceived as legitimate?
Like it has to have like a substantial military power and be able to be self-sustaining.
Right.
It has to be used having a just claim to its power.
Exactly. It's a very good definition. Legitimacy is the belief that those in power have the right to rule in the first place. What are some sources of legitimacy?
The law.
Mm-hmm.
The people.
I was going to say hegemony.
In international politics, these are broken down to 3 categories. Traditional. And this is sort of what we've described, military power, market power, cultural power. Second is charismatic. Can anyone think of some countries or states that are perceived as legitimate because of charisma?
Cuba,
Why? Why do you say that?
because it was a dictatorship and we're all behind Fidel, which it's not really traditional to have someone take over your government.
Nazi Germany.
And why do you say that Nazi Germany?
Because,
legitimate because of charisma.
well, because Hitler just had like that sort of intense personal magnetism that convinced like everyone to just follow him and elect him dictator.
Does charisma only define dictatorial regimes? Can charisma define local democracies?
America?
Why? Who?
Well, to give an example, when America was, I don't know, formed, they were going to elect George Washington for a third term because they liked him.
Well, like many American presidents could be considered elected on charisma, like Barack Obama, for example.
Let's talk about Obama. What did people in international politics say about that election between McCain and Obama? What did people think about Obama in other countries? Did he have a pretty favorable rating? Were people pretty attracted by him internationally?
Well, yeah, he was
Yeah.
military.
He was. People were excited for, a new foreign policy doctrine that they thought that would improve relations around the world, open up trade, etc. was defined by charisma internationally. Right? What are some things that defined illegitimacy of the U.S. in the previous administration, the Bush administration?
Unpopular policies.
What policy?
Specifically the war on terror.
Right.
A lot of people.
Anything else?
Also his space program, like how he wiggled his way out of a lot of weaponization treaties, and how his national space policy was based off an idea of domination rather than cooperation.
Right. A lot of focus, literature, news articles would say that the United States was not perceived so legitimately under that administration. There was a loss of credibility, right? And that was expected to change under a new administration. Be a more legitimate power. Thirdly, we have rational / legal. Some of you already mentioned this in defining legitimacy. What can we think of as rational or legal legitimacy? Yeah, Jeff.
You like in like a traditional like monarchy, like legal legitimacy, like if you like inherit power from your family, that could give you legal or right to rule.
Wallace.
I would say like a constitution or a set system of doing things with checks and balances and stuff.
Right. You've all discussed how laws and legal frameworks sort of create order. Do we think instability and chaotic domestic politics foster legitimacy internationally? No, most likely not. But a country with a strong legal framework and order probably perceived well. And sort of the next step is authority. Authority is power with legitimacy. Can anyone name me some potential states? They are not internationally recognized as states currently. Some potential would-be states. Jamil.
Puerto Rico.
Not to the United States federal government. Remember, we've already gone over this, right? A state is not only one of 50 things in international politics.
Palestine.
Yep. potential states. Palestine is not a state because Israel still retains the ability to use coercion in all of its territory. All right, there's been a lot of recent debate on whether the United Nations would recognize Palestinian statehood, right, to become its own dependent state. Any other examples of potential states? This doesn't have to be right now. This could have even been at a point in time where a currently recognized state was not.
Well, the Basque separatists in Spain and France recently dropped their claim to legitimacy, but for a long time, the Basque people wanted their own state.
Exactly. It's a very good example. Sartok. Mm-hmm.
The American colonies during the Revolution and then later the South during the Civil War.
Sure. What about Iraq? Was there a time when they weren't a state in recent history? In 2005, Iraq was not a state. At this point in time, they were not considered a state because the United States had the ability to use coercive force within all of its territory.
Haiti during the Haitian Revolution.
And why do you say that one?
Because they were fighting for independence from the French. They were a French colony. And
Right,
they were fighting
but
for
just
independence,
because,
they weren't considered.
you know, there's necessarily a movement or uprising doesn't mean statehood just goes away, right? If there's an effective separatist movement, right, secession is effective, then there are possibilities for recognition. But there's no, just because you've moved off, just because you fought, just because you've taken out a government, right, does not mean a new state is just automatically recognized internationally. What about some failed states? Can anyone tell me what a failed state is? Jeff?
It's a state where the government has really lost control over the country and really been ruled by slash like Yemen.
Right, I mean, it's quite simple, right? You know, a state that has failed. There's not effective governance, most likely not even governance structures anymore. There is no law and order for perceived legitimacy. How do we think failed states are perceived, legitimate or illegitimate? Somalia, 91. There was no central claim to legitimacy at all. Afghanistan, 05. No central claim to legitimacy at all. The monopoly claim on coercive authority within the territory is tenuous at best outside of the capital. Anybody think of any other examples of what might be considered a failed state? Christian?
Burma,
Why?
because the government fell apart, and now they're just like different sects fighting all the time for power.
Are you citing Myanmar historically or today?
I think it's more of today now, I'm not sure.
Well, the government in Myanmar is doing quite well today, but there are times, and have been times historically, with governmental collapse, and there is still civil strife in the country.
Question, does it count if there's a central government that claims the country but only controls a part of the capital city?
Well, tell me the example you're thinking.
Again, I want to say it's Yemen, but I'm pretty sure there's a alleged president who controls a couple blocks of the city or something. Does that kind of fail the state, or do they have to have new territory to control?
So you think because there's secessionist rhetoric and not complete governance
No, the
and
government.
coordination between the North and the South, that Yemen is considered a failed state?
Well, I'm pretty sure the government has.
Can you tell me an international body that has defined Yemen as a failed state?
No.
Because remember, how do we recognize these sorts of things? Right? How do we recognize legitimacy? How do we recognize statehood?
Oh, well, I guess if everybody else still thinks it's a legit state, then it technically is still a state, right?
Right. Who recognizes statehood?
Everybody published.
The UN. Right? International bodies that are composed of what?
Nations.
States.
Would Syria count?
And why do you say that?
Because the government is being opposed by UN sanctions, at least parts of the UN.
Sure, but by that logic, does any country that has sanctions imposed mean it no longer has statehood? Because there are a lot of countries internationally that have sanctions, but what do we normally call those sorts of countries? We don't really trust, not complete legitimacy maybe?
Pariah states.
Sure. What's another word that is probably more often used than pariah? Rogue states. What are some examples of what we consider rogue states internationally?
Iran,
And why do we consider them a rogue state?
because they're currently developing nuclear weapons despite pretty much everybody except China telling them not to.
Who else? And why do we say this about North Korea?
Because it's not, it doesn't really listen to other countries and everything, and it just operates on its own agenda.
And do we have similar suspicions about nuclear capabilities about Iran? Anyone else we consider a rogue state? Or a pariah? How about a country you brought up previously, Christian?
Myanmar?
Yeah. Myanmar, until recent history, was suspected to be developing nuclear weapons, getting material from their prominent trade partner, North Korea. We severed all diplomatic relations with Myanmar in the 80s, and only started within this last year to speak to them. Obviously, you can see why that would fit under the definition of a pariah state. There was no international recognition, there was no humanitarian aid. They were left on their own. Yeah.
Back to rogue states, Cuba.
Why?
Well, the U.S. has the trade blockade, and I think a lot of the other NATO countries won't trade with them and prevent other people from doing so as well. And they are technically at least they're a totalitarian state. They are considered a rogue state, aren't they?
But don't you think we would normally put nations under this category with maybe a significant threat assessment?
Well, true, but I mean, it's so geographically close to the United States. I mean, there was the whole missile crisis there, I'm just saying.
It was like 40 years ago.
Do you think for capability of other countries to abuse
It's geographical location.
the geographic location of Cuba
Well, potentially.
makes it a rogue state?
Well,
Sartosh.
I mean, rogue state is international. To be a rogue state, it has to be internationally seen as rogue
Just
state.
because you disagree with the United States, or the United States does not want to trade with you, does not make you a rogue state. There are a lot of countries in the world that the United States does not have a free trade agreement with. Right? All of those countries are not lumped into this category.
it's not a complete embargo.
By definition, means lack of trade.
Okay.
sovereignty. Can anyone tell me what this concept is?
The free ability to be autonomous in your own country.
Sure. Do sovereign countries respond to any higher authority? Why would they not respond to a higher authority?
Because they're in charge of their own government.
Right. The U.S., having all coercive authority within Iraq in 2005, was Iraq a sovereign nation at that point?
No.
No, they did not have control over all coercive force within their territory. Sovereignty is a state-level analysis. Sovereignty is defined by the characteristic of the state. In fact, it is the defining characteristic of a state. Absent this, you will not be recognized or given recognition of statehood. You cannot make a claim to sovereignty. An entity is considered sovereign when it has the highest political authority within its sphere, right, within its territory. It has the highest political authority in that system. It answers to no higher authority or power. Jack?
So then, what about like the European Union? Would the individual states of that be considered fully sovereign?
Why do you say they're not?
Well, because
They share a currency?
No, but they have like mutual like influence over one another, like how they can like the austerity measures and that Germany is currently attempting to impose on everyone else over there.
Does that mean that Spain does not have coercive authority within its territory because there are overlapping economic policies?
No, I'm saying full sovereignty.
Right.
Just
Why
sovereignty.
why do you think there's a lack of sovereignty?
Just because like the European Union is capable of exerting significant influence on any one European state.
So any multipolar world is absent sovereignty?
Well,
Because there is a sharing of power within a region, there is no sovereignty?
but is the European Union a separate authority between the different governments of the European Union? Isn't it sort of like...
The European Union is sovereign. By definition, sovereignty means no other unit has coercive authority within a state's territory. So obviously we can see in cases of military invasion, right? A state does not have that ultimate authority and thus no sovereignty. Can anyone tell me where this concept originated?
Woodrow Wilson's 14 Points.
Way before that. (1648), the principle of sovereignty was first articulated in the Treaty of Westphalia. This treaty ended the 30 Years' War by giving rulers authority to determine religion within their own territories.
What treaty was that?
The Treaty of Westphalia. And there were subsequent recognitions of sovereignty in later treaties that further codified and defined sovereignty. But this is the origination. This is the first articulation of this idea. Was sovereignty always used in international politics? Was there ever an alternative to sovereignty that anyone could think of? So no, this is the only possible system that we have. What do we do for this?
military power?
No,
Imperial system?
kind of. But what's,
Oh, feudalism.
yes, feudalism. Feudalism is what we used for sovereignty. It preceded the sovereign state system, right? These, governments or kingdoms were not territorial, and they had overlapping authorities. What about an alternative to the state system? Can anyone think of something we use besides a state? What did the Romans have?
They had a province system, or imperial system,
When you think of the phrase, the Roman,
empire.
yeah,
They had an imperial system.
empire. An empire consists of a metropole and then its colonies. Right? There's not a singular territorial distinguishment. Examples, we have ancient Rome, England, France, Britain, India, Jamaica, Tahiti, Lebanon, etc. Tons. There's a different political status between the people in the metropole and the colonies. Right? Think of, the American colonies, right? We had our metropole in Britain where all the rules were being designated from. Then different legal structure and framework for what the colonies were able to do. And the same with Rome and its metropole and all of its colonies spread out. Typically, the colonies retain some local control, while the metropole controls all external affairs, controls all foreign policy, right? Britain was the one making all of trade policy, right? It distinguished down in the colonies how trade policy would function. Thus, this concept of sovereignty is what creates anarchy in international politics.
Taking proper notes, you was writing more down than just what Kyle puts up on the board. Note taking requires writing extra things down.
In the international system, there is no higher authority to provide public goods or enforce contracts among states, right? All of the states do not answer to a higher power. Once you reach the level of statehood, there is an anarchy among states. And all agreements among states have to be self-enforced, right? Because there's no higher group that enforces those rules. What do we do about violations of sovereignty? When another country decides to infringe upon the sovereignty of another?
War.
Sure. Did you raise your hand, Jack?
No.
The system is anarchic, right? There's no higher authority. But within that anarchy, there is a hierarchy among the levels of states, right? One of the examples of this we already talked about. Empire. Example, the United States and Guam. Protectorate, France and Monaco. Intervention, Can anyone give me an example of this?
When the US goes to some country and,
Specific example,
Iraq,
right? The US and Iraq. What are some sources of power in international politics? We already sort of defined some of these.
money and military.
Military power. There's two more.
Financial power, commercial power.
Market power. Third one. Cultural power. And what are some sources of those different types of power? Those can be population, land, natural resources. How do we define the hierarchy of states, the strength of power in international politics?
Well, I think in the present day, it's primarily military power and market power that,
Well, we use a phrase. We call the United States a what power?
hegemonic
No.
or global.
Right, a superpower, a great power. A great power is a state that can project power across the system. Different forms of this are multipolarity, like within the EU, which is 3 or more great powers. Bipolarity, which is 2 great powers. Can anyone tell me a historical example of bipolarity?
Cold War, USSR
Yep.
and US.
Bipolarity is related with relative stability. The historical example of that is between the Soviet Union and the US during the Cold War. What's another way back example? Ancient Greece, Athens and Sparta are another good example of a bipolar international system. Third one, unipolarity. When do we think we see unipolarity? Yeah.
After the Cold War, for a while after the Cold War, the U.S.'s unipolarity.
Yep, the U.S. right now.
What about China?
In a unipolar world. China is not a superpower. To be answered in the future, maybe? Sure.
Why is China not a superpower right now?
Currently, China is just an economy that is growing. They are not considered a superpower with relative influence to the United States. We live in a unipolar system right now. It means one. China's military compared to the United States, joke. And especially with the recent Asia pivot that we've made to China and East Asia.
What's that?
To sway countries in our favor and moving all of our military from the Middle East to Asia. Because we will not let China expand throughout the region is the basis for that policy. We've discussed state actors. What are the other kinds of actors?
Non-state actors.
What are some examples of those? Yeah.
ExxonMobil. Just because I know they're international, they're acting internationally.
Well, okay.
Any major.
What are they considered?
They're a
Like what are-
corporation.
Right, a multinational corporation. MNC, Exxon. We've got UNCs. What else? What are some other non-state actors? We named these at the beginning. NGOs, what are those?
Non-government organizations.
IGOs, what are those?
Intergovernmental organizations.
Intergovernmental or just international organizations. Fourthly, we have nations. What's a nation?
A body of people under one culture but not one government.
Right. A body of people that have a common identity, right? Defined by nationalism. There's a common history, there's a common origin. There's a claim to a homeland, a desire for self-rule. What about a nation state?
One particular culture or group of people that's also self-governing.
Sure. In a nation state, the boundaries of the state territory and membership of the nation are coterminous. This is the ideal type of actor in the post-World War II era. What are some examples of nation states?
The United States.
Why?
Because there's a sort of American culture within the 50 American states and also within one government.
Sure. Also Japan is a good example. What about multinational states? We have China and Tibet. Stateless nations. We have the Kurds, right, in the Middle East with Iraq, Turkey, Iran. We have the Basque example in Spain and France that are stateless nations. What's a divided nation? Should be pretty easy.
Egypt.
Korea. North Korea, South Korea. What are some examples of international organizations? We've been using this one throughout the lecture to define statehood.
Oh, UN.
And what else did you say?
NATO.
Yeah, the UN, NATO. These are institutions with formal procedures and membership. Only states are members of these groups. The purpose can be broad or narrow. We can also have the UN, right, which is open to pretty much all states. But you can also have the AU, which is the African Union, right? Obviously, not open to everyone. It's a more narrowly defined group of who can be in it, but it's a group that can be composed of multiple states. What about NGOs? Who can be in there?
Al-Qaeda.
Anyone else? The Roman Catholic Church, Red Cross, Greenpeace, Doctors Without Borders. These are all examples of NGOs that are non-states and non-profit. These include religions, charities, political activism, academic research communities, and even terrorist groups. Now let's go into the theories. Realism. Anyone have any clue what this could mean?
The idea that states act in their own interest.
Right. States act in their own self-interest. The primary concern is security, national security. Right? Actions are taken not for absolute benefit of every party involved, but for only your state. Right? It doesn't care about morality or ethics, law. Those are not primary concerns. Security is what matters. Also, the irrelevance of domestic political systems. It doesn't care if you're a democracy or if you're a dictatorship. If you can be used to help security, then you're a relevant partner. Although cooperation is not all too common in this system. Power. Power, power, power is the only thing that matters here. They view the world as zero sum. Can anyone tell me what zero sum means?
Nobody?
There's always a trade-off. Let's look at the US and China, right? If China grows by GDP at all, if China takes over or sways one state in East Asia, the United States views that as a direct loss. The US views any gain by the Chinese in international politics as a loss for the United States. Right? It's a very tit for tat. Their opinions on human nature is that humans are inherently aggressive and evil or greedy. We are prone to violence. It's basically social Darwinism, right? Survival of the fittest. Cognitive science will say that, you're not born as a blank slate. You've got to have some foundations that enable you to learn in the first place. So we are born innately to be violent and to strive for power in our self-interest. This is defined by anarchy. There are no rules. It is an anarchic world under realism. To preserve peace, we use a balance of power. We already cited this example. In the Cold War, what was the balancing actors?
That was the Soviet Union.
Yep. What about in East Asia? What are some balancing powers?
Balancing powers, you have like China, and then you have like Taiwan, Korea, Japan, etc.
China, Japan, and the United States are balancing powers in East Asia. States are central to this. They could care less about NGOs or international organizations. States are the central component of a realist ideology. Right? The nature of power can change, right? China can be the unipole. But under realism, the concept of interest is what remains consistent. Every power works in self-interest. Second, we have liberalism, or also defined by American academics as idealism. Power is not the only thing that matters in this system. States have common interests, common values. We're very prone to cooperate. This system's view of human nature is that humans are innately good, right? We want to cooperate for mutual benefit of everyone. This system highly pays attention to non-state actors, international organizations and NGOs. This is an international system that is based on laws, i.e. treaties, and institutions like the UN or the World Trade Organization. This is a pluralist system, right? Pluralism, meaning multiple or differentiated. Not only the state is relevant in this system. States are at the center, but we also have MNCs, multinational corporations, or NGOs or IGOs that enforce law and protocol. Unlike realism, where states forgo cooperation and worry about relative gains in a zero-sum world, in liberalism, we seek absolute gains, right? What is mutually beneficial for the international sphere, right? And they think one of those most prominent things is trade. Liberalism highly pays attention to domestic systems and forms of government, right? The system very strongly believes in democratic peace theory, that democracies are the countries you want to work with, and those that aren't, we should probably change them in some manner or form to be democracies. That rogue states are generally defined as countries that are not democracies, that are most likely dictatorships, and any other form of government is most likely prone to violent activity. The third and last theory is constructivism. Constructivism is essentially a critique of both of these two theories. These are the two prominent theories in IR today, right? There are some other things like Marxism, but that's a joke in international relations scholarship. It's been indicted enough times. Attacked, answered, responded to, shown to be incorrect. Nation states are not all alike and the same in this system. It's culture that shapes foreign policy, a political culture of a state. The form of government is also highly relevant in this IR theory. Right? What type of government do the states have? History shapes foreign policy. Domestic political trends and debates shape foreign policy. Unlike realism and liberalism, who come from a positivistic school of knowledge, which means we rely on empirics, statistics, data to determine whether things are true or not. What is epistemically relevant is based on positivism in these two theories. This is you can associate positivism with scientific. Unlike scientific and structural empirical traditions, constructivism, it considers itself to be post-positivistic, right? Deconstructing the ontological assumptions of traditional IR theory, right? That we presume all states act the same and rationally in their self-interest. States have identity in this theory, which is highly irrelevant to how foreign policy is approached. In states, identity influences the way that states interact with each other internationally. Some examples of this are A, the U.S. desire to transform the world in its image, right? We would like other like-minded economic systems, like-minded governmental systems like democracies. We probably think those are easier to work with, trade with, produce conflict. B, the Chinese sensitivity to any policy of other states in international politics that threaten its unity and sovereignty. And lastly, we'll go and draw out a little chart which makes all of this very, very simple. Here we have realism. Liberalism and constructivism. So the nature of the international system. Who can answer this for realism? What is the nature of the international system? How does it look out there?
Humans are evil and greedy and selfish.
Sure. But what's one word for that? It starts with an A. It's how they view the world.
Anthropocentric.
No.
Anarchic. Anarchy.
It's an anarchy. There's no higher power than states. The answer to they are rational and they act in their self-interest. There's no international security mechanism. What about liberalism or idealism? How do they view the world? Is it the same? Is it an anarchy? Yeah, it is. They view the world as anarchy. They have a different concept of human nature. Right? States are still the most relevant form, but it's pluralistic. It also considers MNCs, IGOs, NGOs, because there's no international mechanism to enforce the treaties or agreements between states, right? There's only states. There's no super state that everybody goes and answers to and says, if I violate, a treaty, what are the repercussions, right? Treaties are only self-enforcing by states. What about constructivism? Does constructivism think the same things these two think? No, constructivism is set up to be a critique of these two systems. Constructivism thinks the international system is socially constructed. Key actors. What are the key actors in realism? Yep. What are the key actors in liberalism? But there's a little bit more than just states.
States and NGOs.
Right, and what have we defined that as? It starts with a P.
Pluralism.
Yeah. States are primary, but they're not the only, right? We have all of the other non-state actors included. Constructivism says this is based on shared ideas. Interests. What are the key interests of realists? National security, right? Survival. What about liberalism? Jack?
Cooperation.
Right? It's based on cooperation and preferences. What about constructivism? What are the interests in constructivism? Right? Is it survival and security? No. It's quite similar to liberalism, in fact, in that it's based on cooperation of shared interests. Last category is going to be debate applications. Where are some debate arguments or ideas where we see realism come up?
Hegemony advantages.
Hegemony. Christian?
You can do like a security critique, could be an answer.
Right. Criticisms of the idea that international politics should be based on survival or threat assessment of different actors in international politics. What about liberalism? What are some debate applications of this argument?
Like the various, like, reject capitalism case.
Liberalism loves capitalism. Liberalism thinks free trade is awesome.
SCAFTA, or when it existed.
Right. Trade in various trade agreements.
Econ.
Why?
Because it's about trade, so if you have a strong economy,
Right. Interdependence is highly relevant to this system. That's how we sort of regulate actions, because we think states rely on each other and that we should cooperate. And that's the most mutually beneficial way to engage in international politics. And what about constructivism? What are some debate applications of the constructivist school of thought? We've already got one of them up here.
Security K?
Right. The constructivism is set up to criticize these two ideas. The international system isn't always rational, right? So criticisms of the idea that all states act in their self-interest rationally is constructed or skewed, is what the constructivist would say. And now we're going to have Jackie come talk about a particular application and a particular concept highly relevant in today's international politics: terrorism.
Let's take a 5-minute break. Be back at 11.